The lantern swayed gently in the growing darkness, casting long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Dust Valley's only stable. Outside, the wind carried whispers of the approaching storm, a low moan that seemed to echo the unspoken desperation of the small Nevada town. It was October 17th, 1887, when Isaac Merritt first appeared at the edge of town, his tall silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the amber horizon, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and wearing a coat too heavy for the desert climate. Martha Holloway, the widow who ran the general store, would later testify that she noticed his hands first, calloused and scarred, yet steady when he placed $3 silver on her counter. "Coffee, salt, and information," he had said, his voice low and measured. His eyes, she recalled, seemed to search for something beyond the dusty shelves of her store. Something that perhaps wasn't there at all. Dust Valley had once been a promising silver mining settlement built on the dreams of fortune seekers who believed the mountains harbored secrets that would make them rich. By 1887, those dreams had crumbled into dust, much like the valley that cradled the town. The silver had run thin, and so had the patience of those who remained. The 57 residents who still called Dust Valley home existed in a delicate balance between resignation and hope. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, a man whose authority extended as far as the town's meager borders, noted Isaac's arrival in his daily log with a single line: "Stranger arrived, claims to be passing through." The brevity of this entry belied the suspicion with which Blackwood regarded the newcomer. In a town where everyone's history was common knowledge, a man without a past was a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. Isaac took a room at Eleanor Winter's boarding house, paying for 2 weeks in advance. Eleanor, a woman whose face carried the map of her 63 years in its wrinkles, assigned him the corner room on the second floor, the one with the window facing east toward the mountains and west toward the vast, empty desert. "He asked for that room specifically," she would later recall. "Said he needed to see both where the sun rose and where it set." For the first 3 days, Isaac established a routine that seemed designed to disarm suspicion. He rose at dawn, took breakfast in the boarding house kitchen, and spent his mornings sitting on the porch of the general store, whittling small wooden figures that he would leave on the steps of houses with children. By noon, he would be at the saloon, nursing a single whiskey for hours, listening more than speaking. It was on the 4th day that Isaac broke his pattern. He approached Samuel Keegan, the aging stable owner whose arthritis had bent his once-tall frame into a permanent stoop. Witnesses would later recall the intensity with which the two men spoke, heads bent close together, voices too low to overhear. By sunset, Isaac had secured employment at the stables, tending to the handful of horses still kept in the town. What no one in Dust Valley knew, what they couldn't have known, was that Isaac Merritt was not the name he had been born with. The name on his birth certificate, filed in a courthouse in Ohio some 32 years earlier, was Daniel Wakefield. The man now known as Isaac carried the weight of that other life like a stone in his pocket, smooth from constant handling but still heavy with memory. The afternoon of October 24th brought the first signs of the storm that would later become infamous in the history of the region. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry gray. The air grew dense with anticipation, charged with electricity that seemed to make every surface hum with potential energy. Samuel Keegan, sensing the approaching tempest, instructed Isaac to secure the stable doors and ensure that the horses were calm. "Animals know when something's coming," he told Isaac. "They feel it in ways we've forgotten how to." Isaac nodded, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted. A recognition, perhaps, or a decision made. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall on the parched earth, Isaac worked methodically, checking latches and distributing feed. The horses grew restless, moving nervously in their stalls, rolling their eyes as thunder rumbled in the distance. All except for one, a black mare named Shadow that Samuel had raised from a foal. She remained eerily still, her dark eyes fixed on Isaac as he moved through the stable. Just as the sky opened and rain began to fall in earnest, Eleanor Winters noticed smoke rising from the direction of the stables. By the time Sheriff Blackwood and a handful of townspeople arrived at the scene, flames had already engulfed half the structure. Through the sheets of rain and the choking smoke, they saw Isaac Merritt standing in the stable doorway, silhouetted against the inferno behind him. In one hand, he held Samuel Keegan's silver pocket watch. In the other, the reins of Shadow, the only horse to survive what would later be determined as deliberate arson. He looked at us, Martha Holloway would later state, not like a man caught in wrongdoing, but like someone who had finally found what he had been searching for. Then he mounted the horse and rode straight into the storm. What happened next would become the subject of speculation, rumor, and eventually legend in Dust Valley and beyond. As Isaac rode away from the burning stable, witnesses claimed that the storm seemed to part around him, creating a corridor of calm in the midst of chaos. Sheriff Blackwood and 3 volunteers pursued him into the night, but the rain had already begun to wash away any tracks, and the darkness swallowed any hope of visual pursuit. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The stories we share are meticulously researched pieces of American history that mainstream education often overlooks. By subscribing, you're preserving these forgotten narratives that deserve to be told. The storm that engulfed Dust Valley on that fateful October night raged for 3 days, transforming the arid landscape into a treacherous expanse of mud and flash floods. When the clouds finally parted and the sun reclaimed its dominion over the Nevada sky, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood assembled a search party to track down Isaac Merritt. 5 men, each carrying a rifle and 3 days' provisions, set out on what they believed would be a straightforward pursuit of a criminal. "We'll find him before sundown," Blackwood had assured Mayor Edwin Porter before departing. "A man alone in the desert leaves a trail, no matter how hard the rain tried to wash it away." But Isaac Merritt had seemingly vanished into the vast emptiness that surrounded Dust Valley. The search party followed what meager signs they could find. A partial hoofprint preserved in hardening mud, a scrap of fabric caught on a mesquite bush, the remains of a small fire hidden in the shelter of a rock formation. Each clue led them further from town, deeper into the unforgiving territory that had claimed many unwary travelers before them. On the 3rd day of their search, as supplies dwindled and determination waned, they discovered the remains of Samuel Keegan's prized mare, Shadow. The horse lay at the bottom of a narrow ravine, her neck broken from what appeared to be a fall. Of Isaac Merritt, however, there was no sign. "It's as if the earth opened up and swallowed him whole," Joseph Miller, one of the search party members, would later remark to his wife. "Or perhaps the desert claimed him, like it does so many who don't respect its power." Sheriff Blackwood, reluctant to return to Dust Valley empty-handed, extended the search for 2 more days before finally conceding defeat. In his official report, filed upon his return, he wrote, "Suspect Isaac Merritt presumed dead in the desert. Justice, in this instance, appears to have been served by nature itself. But the story of Isaac Merritt, or Daniel Wakefield as he had once been known, did not end in that desolate stretch of Nevada desert, as many in Dust Valley assumed. In fact, it had begun many years earlier and many miles away in the green hills of Ohio. Daniel Wakefield had been born to a modest farming family in the spring of 1855. His childhood was unremarkable, save for 2 details that would later prove significant: an uncommon affinity for horses and an intense, almost obsessive sense of justice. His mother, Elizabeth, often recounted how young Daniel would spend hours in the stable, whispering to the draft horses that worked their small farm, and how he would become inconsolable at any perceived unfairness, whether directed at himself or others. At the age of 17, Daniel's life changed irrevocably when he witnessed a crime that would haunt him for years to come. Returning home from a neighboring farm late one evening, he came upon 3 men in the process of stealing his family's horses. Hidden by darkness, Daniel watched as his father confronted the thieves and was subsequently beaten to death while his mother was forced to watch. The authorities investigated, but with little evidence beyond Daniel and Elizabeth's descriptions, the case remained unsolved. The 3 men, one with a distinctive scar across his right cheek, one with a silver pocket watch he consulted frequently, and one with a peculiar limping gait, disappeared, taking with them not only the Wakefield horses, but also any sense of security the family had known. Elizabeth Wakefield never recovered from the trauma of that night. She died 6 months later, leaving 19-year-old Daniel alone with his grief and a growing obsession with finding the men responsible for destroying his family. He sold the farm, placed the modest proceeds in a bank account, and began what would become a 15-year journey across America, following rumors, whispers, and occasional sightings of the three distinctive men. This quest led Daniel, now using various aliases to avoid detection, through bustling cities and forgotten hamlets, working odd jobs and occasionally as a lawman himself. He developed a reputation in certain circles as a man who could track anyone no matter how far they ran or how well they hid. What those who hired him didn't realize was that every tracking job he took was, in his mind, practice for the day he would finally confront his father's killers. In the spring of 1886, Daniel's persistent inquiries led him to a saloon in Missouri, where he encountered a drunk prospector who claimed to have partnered briefly with a man who matched the description of the thief with the silver pocket watch. The prospector, too inebriated to recognize the intensity in Daniel's eyes, happily shared that his former partner now owned a stable in a small Nevada mining town called Dusk Valley. Daniel, now adopting the name Isaac Merritt, spent the next year carefully planning his approach. He researched the town's layout, learned about its residents, and prepared himself for the confrontation he had been anticipating for half his life. What he didn't prepare for was the possibility that Samuel Keegan, the stable owner with the distinctive silver pocket watch, might not remember him or the crime that had defined Daniel's existence. When Isaac finally arrived in Dusk Valley, he had expected immediate recognition in Keegan's eyes. Instead, he found an aging man with gnarled hands and clouded memories, who looked at him with nothing more than the casual suspicion reserved for all strangers. This apparent lack of recognition inflamed Isaac's sense of injustice. How could Keegan not remember the night that had destroyed the Wakefield family? How could he live a seemingly peaceful life while Elizabeth and Jonathan Wakefield lay in forgotten graves? The storm that arrived on October 24th provided Isaac with the cover he needed. In the chaos of wind and rain, he confronted Keegan in the stable, revealing his true identity and demanding acknowledgement of the crime committed 15 years earlier. What transpired between the two men in those final moments would have remained known only to them, had it not been for a letter discovered months later, hidden in the binding of a Bible in Isaac's abandoned room at the boarding house. In this letter, addressed to no one in particular, Isaac detailed his confrontation with Keegan. He described the old man's initial confusion, followed by the slow dawning of recognition, and, finally, a confession that shattered Isaac's carefully constructed narrative of vengeance. Samuel Keegan admitted to being present during the theft of the Wakefield horses and the murder of Jonathan Wakefield, but claimed he had been forced to participate by his companions, the scarred man and the limping man, who had threatened his own family. "I've carried the shame of that night with me every day since," Keegan had told Isaac, according to the letter. "I've tried to atone by living an honest life, by helping others, by caring for these animals with the same reverence your father showed his horses." This unexpected confession left Isaac at a crossroads. The righteous vengeance he had anticipated was complicated by Keegan's apparent remorse and the years of atonement he claimed to have lived. In those moments, as the storm raged outside and his certainty wavered, Isaac made a decision that would seal both their fates. The flames that consumed Dusk Valley's stable on that stormy night in October 1887 were not, as many residents initially believed, the result of lightning or misplaced lanterns. They were kindled by the hands of a man who had carried the cold ember of vengeance within him for 15 years, only to find that its heat, when finally released, brought no warmth or satisfaction. As the third week of November settled over Dusk Valley, life had begun to return to a semblance of normalcy. The remains of the stable had been cleared away, plans for rebuilding were being discussed, and the mysterious stranger who had briefly disrupted their lives was fading into memory. Until November 18th, when Eleanor Winters, while cleaning the room Isaac had occupied, discovered the hidden letter that would reignite the town's interest in the vanished drifter. Sheriff Blackwood, upon reading Isaac's confessional account, immediately dispatched telegrams to law enforcement agencies across multiple states sharing the true identity of their arsonist and the crimes he had been pursuing. Responses trickled in slowly over the following weeks, piecing together a more complete picture of Daniel Wakefield's crusade across America. What do you think someone should say after reading this unbelievable story? Leave a comment with the words, "Justice finds a way, even through the storm." From Ohio came confirmation of the Wakefield murders and horse theft in 1872. From Kansas, reports of a man matching Daniel's description who had briefly served as a deputy before disappearing after apprehending a horse thief with a distinctive scar across his right cheek, the first of the 3 men responsible for the Wakefield tragedy. From Colorado, accounts of a private investigator who had tracked and confronted a man with a peculiar limp suspected in multiple livestock thefts, the second of the Wakefield murderers. These reports painted a picture of Daniel Wakefield as a man consumed by a single purpose, methodically hunting down those who had destroyed his family. Samuel Keegan, it seemed, was the final name on his list, the last thread connecting Daniel to his past and the crime that had defined his life. But the most startling revelation came not from official channels, but from a letter that arrived in Dust Valley in early December, postmarked from San Francisco. The letter was addressed to Sheriff Thomas Blackwood and signed by Isaac Merritt. "I write to you not to seek forgiveness or to justify my actions," the letter began, "but to complete the record of events that began in Ohio 15 years ago and culminated in your town this past October." Isaac's letter detailed his escape from Dust Valley during the storm, riding Samuel Keegan's black mare until the exhausted animal lost its footing in the treacherous, rain-soaked terrain of the desert. After the horse's fatal fall, Isaac continued on foot, walking through the night and the following day, guided only by his instinct and the distant silhouette of mountains to the west. "I had expected to feel liberation after confronting Keegan," Isaac wrote, "but found only a hollow victory that tasted of ash. The man I killed was not the monster I had constructed in my memory, but an old man burdened by guilt and seeking his own form of redemption. In destroying him, I fear I have become what I most despised, a thief of life and possibility." The letter went on to explain that Isaac had encountered a group of travelers heading to California who had taken pity on the rain-soaked, exhausted man they found stumbling through the desert. They had provided him with food, dry clothes, and transportation to San Francisco, never knowing the circumstances that had led him to that remote stretch of Nevada wilderness. "I will not run anymore," the letter concluded. "I have secured passage on a ship bound for Australia, departing tomorrow morning. By the time you read these words, I will be beyond your jurisdiction, but not beyond the reach of my own conscience. That, I fear, will pursue me more relentlessly than any lawman ever could." Sheriff Blackwood shared the contents of this letter with the town council, and after much deliberation, they decided not to pursue extradition. The cost would be prohibitive for the small community, and as Mayor Porter pragmatically observed, "The man has removed himself from our society. Perhaps that is punishment enough." But for Martha Holloway, whose brief interactions with Isaac had left her with an inexplicable sense of connection to the troubled drifter, this resolution felt incomplete. In the quiet hours of her store, after the last customer had left and the desert night pressed against the windows, she often found herself thinking of the man with the searching eyes and steady hands. "He was looking for peace," she told her sister in a letter. "Not just justice for his family, but a quieting of the storm within himself. I wonder if he found it in the end, or if he merely carried it with him to another shore." The winter of 1887-1888 was unusually harsh in Dust Valley. Heavy snowfall isolated the town for weeks, forcing the residents into a period of enforced intimacy and reflection. During those long, cold nights, the story of Isaac Merritt, or Daniel Wakefield, became a kind of parable, retold and reinterpreted around hearth fires and oil lamps. For some, like Joseph Miller, who had been part of the search party, Isaac was simply a criminal who had escaped justice. For others, like young Timothy Bennett, who treasured the small wooden horse Isaac had whittled for him, the drifter represented a tragic hero, pursuing a noble cause through flawed means. And for a few, like Eleanor Winters, who had found the hidden letter that revealed his true identity, Isaac embodied the complexity of human nature itself, capable of both calculating vengeance and profound remorse. As snow blanketed the desert, transforming the harsh landscape into something alien and beautiful, the residents of Dust Valley continued to rebuild, to adapt, and to incorporate the brief, violent intrusion of Isaac Merritt into their collective history. They rebuilt the stable, larger and more secure than before. They established a volunteer fire brigade to ensure that such a disaster could be more effectively contained in the future. And gradually, They returned to the rhythm of life that had defined their community before the stranger's arrival. But something had changed in Dust Valley, something subtle yet undeniable. The residents looked at strangers differently now, searching for signs of hidden motives or disguised identities. They regarded their neighbors with both greater suspicion and deeper appreciation, aware that every person carried secrets and regrets beneath the surface of their daily interactions. In this way, Isaac Merritt, a man who had spent only 7 days in their town, left an indelible mark on Dust Valley, altering its collective consciousness in ways that would persist long after the physical evidence of his presence had been erased by time and desert winds. Spring arrived in Dust Valley with unexpected generosity, bringing gentle rains that coaxed improbable blooms from the desert soil. The new stable, constructed through the collective effort of the community during the winter months, stood as a testament to the town's resilience. Samuel Keegan's name had been etched into a simple wooden plaque above the entrance, a memorial to a man whose life and death had been more complex than anyone had initially understood. As the first anniversary of Isaac Merritt's brief but consequential presence in their town approached, Dust Valley was visited by another stranger, whose arrival would further complicate the narrative that had been constructed around the events of October 1887. Her name was Catherine Wakefield, and she introduced herself as Daniel Wakefield's sister, a fact that surprised the residents, as Isaac's letter had made no mention of surviving family. Catherine was 30 years old, with the same intense gaze that many remembered in Isaac, though her demeanor carried a composure that his had lacked. She arrived on the stagecoach from Carson City on a clear April morning, carrying a single leather suitcase and a determination that was evident in the set of her shoulders and the directness of her questions. Sheriff Blackwood received her in his office, where she presented documentation confirming her identity and relationship to Daniel. According to her account, she had been away at school in Pennsylvania at the time of her parents' murder and had returned to find her brother transformed by grief and obsession. Despite her efforts to dissuade him, Daniel had embarked on his quest for vengeance, occasionally sending her cryptic letters from various locations across the country. "The last letter I received from him was postmarked from Missouri nearly 2 years ago," Catherine explained to Sheriff Blackwood. "When communication ceased, I began my own investigation, following the trail of aliases he had used. That search eventually led me here to Dust Valley." Blackwood shared with Catherine the events that had transpired in their town, including the contents of the letters Isaac or Daniel had left behind. He expected grief or perhaps anger in response, but Catherine's reaction was one of quiet resignation. "My brother died years ago," she said after reading the letters. "Not physically, perhaps, but the Daniel I knew, thoughtful, gentle, full of laughter, was buried alongside our parents. The man who called himself Isaac Merritt was shaped by trauma and sustained by vengeance. I've mourned my brother for 15 years. Learning of his fate now is merely the closing of a chapter I had long expected to end in tragedy." Catherine's perspective added new dimensions to the town's understanding of Isaac Merritt. Through her, they learned of Daniel Wakefield's earlier life, his passion for literature, his talent for music, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She shared childhood anecdotes that humanized the figure who had become almost mythological in the minds of Dust Valley's residents, transforming him from a vengeful phantom into a broken man whose path had been irrevocably altered by violence. During her week-long stay in the town, Catherine visited the site of the former stable, spoke with those who had interacted with her brother, and collected the small wooden carvings he had created during his time there. She arranged for a modest headstone to be placed in the town cemetery, though there was no body to bury. The inscription read simply, "Daniel Wakefield, 1855, beloved son and brother, lost but not forgotten." On her final evening in Dust Valley, Catherine accepted Martha Holloway's invitation to dinner at the widow's small house behind the general store. The two women, both marked by loss in different ways, shared a meal and conversation that lasted well into the night. What was discussed between them remained private, but Martha would later tell Eleanor Winters that the evening had brought her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Before departing on the morning stagecoach, Catherine presented Sheriff Blackwood with a leather-bound journal that had belonged to her brother, discovered among his possessions in Missouri. "Perhaps this will help your town understand," she said. Not to justify his actions, but to recognize the humanity behind them. The journal chronicled Daniel Wakefield's transformation into Isaac Merritt and the various other identities he had adopted during his years of pursuit. It detailed his methodical tracking of the three men responsible for his parents' deaths, his strategies for gathering information, and the moments of doubt and exhaustion that had periodically threatened to derail his mission. Most revealing were the entries from the weeks immediately preceding his arrival in Dust Valley. The writing showed increasing instability, with passages of cold calculation interrupted by expressions of existential questioning. "What remains of me beyond this purpose?" he had written just days before arriving in town. "If vengeance is achieved, what identity will be left to claim the victory?" These insights transformed the town's perception of Isaac Merritt once again. He was neither simply villain nor victim, neither hero nor monster, but a man whose life had been defined by a single traumatic rupture. The night violence had invaded the Wakefield farm and irrevocably altered the trajectory of a young man's promising life. As April gave way to May and the desert blooms faded under the strengthening sun, Catherine Wakefield's visit became another layer in the evolving story of Dust Valley. Her presence had humanized her brother, but also underscored the tragedy of his choices, how vengeance had consumed not only its target, but also the one who pursued it. For Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, whose own history included chapters of violence and regret from his years fighting in the Civil War, the Wakefield saga prompted a period of personal reflection. He began spending his evenings on the porch of the jailhouse, watching the sun set over the western horizon, the same direction in which Isaac Merritt had disappeared into the storm nearly 7 months earlier. "We all carry storms within us," Blackwood wrote in his personal journal on the anniversary of Isaac's disappearance. "Some of us find shelter, some weather the tempest, and some become the very destruction they feared." Isaac Merritt chose to become the lightning, and in doing so, lost himself to the storm. The story might have ended there, with Catherine's departure and the town's gradual acceptance of the complex legacy Isaac had left behind. But in late September of 1888, almost a year after the burning of the stable, a package arrived in Dust Valley addressed to Martha Holloway. It bore no return address, but the Australian postage stamps provided a clue to its origin. Inside was an intricately carved wooden music box. When wound, it played a simple, melancholy melody that Martha recognized as a folk song popular in Ohio. Beneath the music box lay a brief note, unsigned but written in a hand she immediately recognized. "The storm has passed. I am learning to live in its aftermath." Martha shared the music box with Eleanor and Catherine, to whom she had been writing regularly since her visit, but kept the note to herself. Some pieces of the story, she decided, were not hers to tell. In the privacy of her room, she would sometimes hold the note to the light, studying the careful script and wondering about the man who had penned it, not the vengeful drifter who had brought fire to their town, nor the traumatized young man from Catherine's stories, but the person who existed now, shaped by both, but defined by neither. "We are all more than our worst acts and our best intentions," she wrote to Catherine that autumn. "Perhaps your brother has finally discovered this truth for himself." The autumn of 1889 arrived in Dust Valley with a subtle shift in the community's collective consciousness. 2 years had passed since the night Isaac Merritt had ridden into the storm, leaving behind a town transformed by his brief but consequential presence. The stable had been rebuilt, stronger than its predecessor. New families had arrived, drawn by modest discoveries of silver in the surrounding hills that had temporarily revitalized the town's original purpose. The story of the drifter who had sought vengeance for a 15-year-old crime had settled into local lore, retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Martha Holloway, now serving her first term as the town's mayor, a position she had reluctantly accepted after Edwin Porter's unexpected death from pneumonia, found herself increasingly preoccupied with Dust Valley's future rather than its past. The wooden music box from Australia gathered dust on her bedroom shelf, though she occasionally wound it during sleepless nights, finding an odd comfort in its melancholy melody. Her correspondence with Catherine Wakefield had continued, evolving from discussions of Daniel Isaac to exchanges about literature, politics, and their respective lives. Catherine had accepted a teaching position at a women's college in Massachusetts, finding purpose in educating young minds. A path she believed her brother might have followed had circumstances been different. Sheriff Blackwood, whose once dark hair had rapidly given way to silver in the years since Isaac's disappearance, had developed a habit of reading Daniel Wakefield's journal on quiet nights, finding in its pages echoes of his own post-war struggles with purpose and identity. The journal had become something of an unofficial text in Dust Valley, passed between residents who found in its raw honesty a mirror for their own unspoken conflicts. It was Blackwood who first noticed the pattern in the regional newspapers that autumn, reports of mysterious charitable donations to orphanages and widows' funds across Nevada and California. Each contribution was accompanied by hand-carved wooden figurines similar to those Isaac had created during his week in Dust Valley. Each donation was made anonymously, though some recipients reported brief encounters with a quiet man whose description bore striking similarities to the drifter who had vanished from Dust Valley 2 years earlier. "Do you think it's him?" Eleanor Winters asked when Blackwood shared his observations over coffee at her boarding house. "Do you think he's found some kind of redemption?" Blackwood's response was measured, shaped by years of observing humanity at its best and worst. "Redemption is a complicated matter, Eleanor. It's not something that can be purchased, even with generous donations. But perhaps he's found a purpose beyond vengeance, and that's a start." The question of Isaac Merritt's possible return to American soil, and the legal implications should he be apprehended, became a subject of quiet debate among Dust Valley's leadership. Martha, as mayor, advocated for clemency should he ever be found, arguing that the town had already processed and, to some degree, healed from the trauma he had inflicted. Sheriff Blackwood, bound by his oath to uphold the law, maintained that arson and potential manslaughter charges would need to be addressed, though he privately admitted to Martha that he hoped Isaac would remain beyond their reach. As winter approached, bringing with it the isolation that heavy snowfall inevitably imposed on the remote town, Dust Valley received another visitor connected to the Merritt-Wakefield saga. Harold Jenkins, a reporter for a San Francisco newspaper, arrived on the last stagecoach before the mountain passes became impassable, carrying with him a portfolio of research and a burning curiosity about the events of October 1887. Jenkins had stumbled upon the story while investigating a series of anonymous donations in California. His journalistic instincts, honed through years of covering everything from political scandals to gold rush revivals, had led him to connect these charitable acts to similar reports from Nevada, which in turn had led him to newspaper accounts of the Dust Valley stable fire and the mysterious drifter who had disappeared into a historic storm. "I believe there's a compelling narrative here," Jenkins explained to Martha during their initial meeting in her office above the general store. "A man driven by trauma and vengeance who finds some form of redemption through anonymous acts of charity. It's a story that speaks to the possibility of human transformation." Martha regarded the reporter with cautious interest. "And what would you hope to accomplish by publishing this story, Mr. Jenkins?" "Isaac Merritt, or Daniel Wakefield if you prefer, has already faced the judgment of this community, and I suspect the harsher judgment of his own conscience. What purpose would be served by exposing him to public scrutiny?" Jenkins's response revealed a depth of thought that Martha hadn't initially credited him with. "Not all exposure is exploitation, Mayor Holloway. Sometimes, sharing a story, especially one of transformation from darkness to light, serves a greater purpose. In these divisive times, a narrative about the possibility of change, about finding one's way back from the brink of moral collapse, might offer hope to readers struggling with their own demons." This perspective resonated with Martha, who had witnessed firsthand the impact Daniel Wakefield's journal had had on various residents of Dust Valley. She agreed to cooperate with Jenkins's research, with certain conditions: no sensationalism, no unverified claims, and final approval of any content related to the town or its residents before publication. Over the following weeks, as winter settled over Dust Valley like a heavy blanket, Jenkins immersed himself in the community and its story. He conducted interviews with everyone who had interacted with Isaac during his brief stay, studied the journal Catherine had left behind, and corresponded with law enforcement officials in multiple states who had encountered Daniel Wakefield during his years of pursuit. What emerged from this research was a portrait more nuanced than even Dust Valley's residents had constructed. Jenkins discovered that during his years tracking his parents' killers, Daniel had performed numerous acts of kindness and justice unrelated to his primary mission. He had rescued children from abusive situations, returned stolen property to rightful owners, and even saved the life of a sheriff in Colorado who had been ambushed by cattle rustlers. These discoveries complicated the narrative further. Had Daniel Wakefield's pursuit of vengeance been the entirety of his character, or merely the framework within which a complex moral identity operated? Had his confrontation with Samuel Keegan and the unexpected nuance he encountered in the old man's confession been the breaking point that shattered this framework and allowed other aspects of his humanity to resurface? As Christmas approached, bringing with it the traditional community gathering in the newly constructed town hall, Jenkins presented Martha with a draft of his article titled "The Redemption of the Drifter, A Tale of Vengeance and Transformation." The piece was thoughtful, balanced, and deeply humane in its treatment of both Isaac, Daniel, and the community of Dust Valley. "I believe this tells the truth as completely as any outsider could hope to capture it," Jenkins told Martha as she reviewed the manuscript by lamplight. "But I sense there are elements of this story that remain known only to you, Mayor Holloway." Martha looked up from the pages, studying the reporter's face before responding. "We all have pieces of this story that we keep private, Mr. Jenkins. Some out of respect for the dead, some out of hope for the living. Your article honors both. I have no objections to its publication." The night of the Christmas gathering, as snow fell gently outside, and the residents of Dust Valley shared food, music, and companionship in the warmth of the town hall, Martha noticed a package that had been placed among the gifts beneath the community tree. It was wrapped in simple brown paper and addressed to the people of Dust Valley. Inside was a collection of exquisitely carved wooden figures: a horse, a stable, a lawman, a shopkeeper, and other recognizable representations of the town and its residents. At the center of this miniature Dust Valley was a small music box similar to the one Martha had received a year earlier. When wound, it played not the melancholy Ohio folk song, but a hopeful melody that several of the older residents recognized as a hymn about forgiveness and new beginnings. There was no note, no signature, nothing to explicitly connect the gift to Isaac Merritt. Yet as the music filled the hall, Martha found herself looking toward the windows, beyond which the vast desert stretched beneath its temporary blanket of snow. Somewhere out there, she believed, a man who had once brought fire to their town was finding his way back to the person he might have been, had grief and vengeance not diverted his path. Harold Jenkins's article was published in the San Francisco Chronicle on January 15, 1890, and subsequently reprinted in newspapers across the country. The story of Isaac Merritt Daniel Wakefield captured the public imagination, inspiring debates about justice, redemption, and the capacity for human transformation. In the years that followed, Martha would occasionally receive postcards from distant locations, Sydney, Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, bearing no message but a small, penciled sketch of a horse similar to the wooden carvings Isaac had created. She kept these cards in the same drawer as the note that had accompanied the music box. Private confirmations of a story that had no conventional resolution, only an ongoing evolution. For the residents of Dust Valley, the legacy of the drifter who had passed through their town on his way to confronting his past became a touchstone. A reminder that every person they encountered carried unseen histories, unspoken traumas, and unrealized potentials for both destruction and redemption. As Sheriff Blackwood wrote in the final entry of his personal journal before retiring in 1892, "In the end, perhaps justice isn't found in punishment or even in restitution, but in the recognition that we are all capable of opening doors that lead to storms, and we are all capable of walking through them and, if we are fortunate, finding our way back again." By the autumn of 1897, a decade after Isaac Merritt had ridden into the storm, Dust Valley had undergone a transformation that few would have predicted. The modest silver discoveries of 1889 had proven more substantial than initially believed, attracting investment and population that had expanded the town beyond its original boundaries. Streets that had once been little more than rutted paths were now properly graded and lined with businesses. The original 57 residents had become nearly 500, bringing with them new perspectives and stories. Martha Holloway, serving her third term as mayor, had overseen this growth with a balanced approach that honored the town's history while embracing its potential. Now in her 60s, with silver dominating her once brown hair, she had become the town's memory keeper, ensuring that even as Dust Valley evolved, it remembered the lessons of its past. On the 10th anniversary of the stable fire, as autumn painted the surrounding mountains in shades of amber and gold, a stranger arrived in Dust Valley. Unlike Isaac Merritt, whose arrival had been noted with suspicion, this visitor drew immediate attention, a well-dressed man in his 50s, whose bearing suggested education and purpose rather than the desperate wandering of a drifter. He checked into the Grand Valley Hotel, the town's newest establishment, under the name Edward Harrington. His stated purpose, research for a book about the transformation of Western mining towns, seemed plausible enough. But there was something in his careful observations and specific questions that caught Martha's attention when they were introduced at a town council meeting. 2 days after his arrival, Edward Harrington requested a private meeting with Mayor Holloway. In her office, with the door closed against curious ears, he revealed his true identity. "My name is Daniel Wakefield," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years and miles. "Though I believe you've suspected as much since we were introduced." Martha studied the man before her, searching for traces of the haunted drifter she had known briefly a decade earlier. The physical resemblances were there, the same strong jawline, the same direct gaze. But the feverish intensity that had defined Isaac Merritt had been replaced by a composed dignity. This was a man who had made peace with his ghosts. "Australia agreed with you, it seems," Martha responded, finally breaking the silence. "Though I confess, I didn't expect you to risk returning to America, let alone to Dust Valley." Daniel nodded, acknowledging both the observation and the implicit question. "The statute of limitations for arson in Nevada is 6 years. I've consulted attorneys to confirm my legal standing before making this journey. As for why I've returned, there are amends that can only be made in person, debts that can only be repaid face to face." Over the course of their conversation, Daniel shared the path his life had taken since fleeing Dust Valley. Australia had indeed been his initial destination, but he had not remained there long. The restlessness that had driven his years of pursuit had transformed into a different kind of movement, a search not for vengeance, but for understanding. "I spent 5 years traveling through places where I had no history, no identity beyond what I chose to present," he explained. "India, China, small villages in Africa, where a white man was a curiosity, but not a threat. In each place, I worked with my hands, building, repairing, creating. I learned to be useful rather than destructive." Eventually, he had settled in England, where he established himself as a craftsman specializing in fine woodwork. The small fortune he had accumulated through his anonymous donations, which he now acknowledged had been funded by the inheritance from his parents that he had preserved during his years of pursuit, was invested in a workshop that employed other men seeking second chances, former convicts, war veterans, those whom society had discarded. "I found purpose in creation," Daniel said, gesturing to a wooden case he had brought with him. Opening it, he revealed an intricately carved model of Dust Valley as it had been in 1887, complete with the original stable and surrounding buildings. "And in remembrance." Martha recognized the craftsmanship immediately. The same hands that had whittled small toys for the children of Dust Valley had created this detailed miniature of the town as it had existed before the fire, before the storm, before the transformation of both the community and the man who had briefly disrupted it. "Why have you really come back, Daniel?" Martha asked, using his true name deliberately. "After all these years, why risk the peace you found?" His answer was simple, but profound. "To close the circle. To face those I wronged not from the safety of distance, but directly. To offer what restitution I can, knowing it will never be adequate." During the week that followed, Daniel Wakefield, still using the name Edward Harrington in public, made quiet visits to those who had been most affected by his actions a decade earlier. To Eleanor Winters, now retired from running the boarding house, he presented a carved replica of her original establishment. To Joseph Miller, who had been part of the search party that had sought him after the fire, he offered both apology and thanks. for his persistence, and for the unintended kindness of abandoning the pursuit. Most significantly, he visited the town cemetery, where Samuel Keegan's grave was marked by a simple headstone. There, observed discreetly by Martha from a respectful distance, Daniel spent an hour in silent communion with the man whose death had marked both the culmination and the collapse of his 15-year quest for vengeance. On his final evening in Dust Valley, Daniel attended a town gathering at Martha's invitation. She introduced him not as Edward Harrington, but as Daniel Wakefield, and in the stunned silence that followed, he addressed the community directly. "I came to your town 10 years ago as a man consumed by a single purpose," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I left having confronted not only the object of my vengeance, but also the cost of that pursuit, to Samuel Keegan, to your community, and to my own humanity. I return now not seeking forgiveness, which I have no right to ask, but offering acknowledgement of the harm I caused and the lessons I've learned from it." The response from the townspeople was as varied as the community itself. Some, particularly newer residents who knew the story only as local legend, regarded Daniel with curiosity rather than judgment. Others, who had lived through the fire and its aftermath, showed a range of reactions from cautious acceptance to lingering anger. Timothy Bennett, no longer the child who had treasured a wooden horse, but a young man working in the assay office, approached Daniel after his speech. "I kept it," he said simply, opening his palm to reveal the small carving Isaac had created for him a decade earlier. "It reminded me that people are more complicated than they first appear." As the gathering concluded and the residents of Dust Valley dispersed into the autumn evening, Martha walked with Daniel to the edge of town, where a hired carriage waited to take him to the train station in the larger settlement 20 miles east. "Will you ever return?" she asked as they stood beneath the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed so much of their shared history. Daniel considered the question, his gaze moving from the lights of the expanding town to the silhouette of mountains against the night sky. "No," he said finally. "This chapter is complete, but I'll carry this place with me, as I suspect it will carry something of me in its memory." Martha nodded, understanding the rightness of this conclusion. "The storm has passed," she said, echoing the words from his note of years earlier. "And we have all learned to live in its aftermath," he completed, offering her a hand in farewell. As Daniel Wakefield's carriage disappeared into the darkness, Martha remained at the edge of town, contemplating the circular nature of the journey that had begun with a young man's trauma in Ohio, passed through violence and vengeance in Nevada, and concluded with a form of peace that, while imperfect, honored the complexity of human experience. In the years that followed, the story of Isaac Merritt Daniel Wakefield became part of Dust Valley's official history, taught to schoolchildren, alongside accounts of silver discoveries and town development. The wooden model he had created was displayed in the town hall, a tangible reminder of how the community had looked before growth and prosperity had transformed it. Occasionally, visitors with an interest in Western history would ask about the drifter of Dust Valley, having encountered the story in books or newspaper archives. Martha Holloway served as mayor until 1905, when age and fatigue finally convinced her to pass the responsibility to younger hands. In her retirement, she compiled a memoir of the town's history, including a chapter dedicated to the week in October 1887, when a stranger had arrived carrying vengeance and departed carrying the burden of its fulfillment. She corresponded regularly with Catherine Wakefield until the latter's death in 1912, and less frequently, but no less meaningfully, with Daniel himself, whose workshop in England continued to thrive under his guidance. The final communication Martha received from Daniel came in the spring of 1915, as the world was being engulfed in the flames of the Great War. It was a simple wooden music box, smaller than those he had sent previously, but crafted with the same meticulous care. The melody it played was neither the melancholy Ohio folk song of his childhood nor the hopeful hymn of his return, but a composition of his own, a piece that moved from darkness to light, from discord to harmony, from isolation to community. The note accompanying this last gift read, "To Martha, who saw the man behind the storm, the circle is complete. The debt, while never fully repayable, has been acknowledged. May Dust Valley continue to thrive, and may its memory of me serve as both warning and possibility. Martha placed this final music box on her bedside table, where its gentle melody accompanied her into sleep each night during her final years. She died peacefully in her home in 1917, having witnessed the complete transformation of the small, struggling settlement she had known into a prosperous town that honored its past while embracing its future. In the town cemetery, beside the graves of Samuel Keegan, Eleanor Winters, and others who had lived through the events of that fateful October, Martha's headstone bore an inscription she had chosen herself. In every life, a storm may come. In its aftermath, we discover who we truly are. And so the story of Dust Valley and the drifter, who had briefly but consequentially passed through it, came to its natural conclusion. Not with dramatic resolution or tidy moral certainty, but with the quiet recognition that human lives, like the desert itself, are shaped by both destructive storms and regenerative aftermaths, by both the wounds we suffer and the healing we pursue, by both the vengeance we may seek and the redemption we may find, if we are fortunate, on the far side of the tempest. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Also, please like this video and share it with anyone who appreciates thoughtful historical narratives. And if you haven't already, check if you're subscribed to this channel for more meticulously researched stories from America's forgotten past.